Hey, good morning everybody. In this video, a close look at the 6061 Black Label Allroad from State Bicycle Company. Now at $1,400 US, you get a pretty good looking entry-level gravel bike. Is this truly a race-ready bike out of the box, or are you gonna have to put in some dollars to get it to a rideable state? All right, so for starters, this is an alloy frame, and it comes with a full carbon fork and front and rear through axles out of the box. It's a 1x drivetrain, and the group set is State's own in-house brand, which I believe is just a rebranded Sensa 1x11 group set. Now the new version of the rear derailleur is clutched, and it runs an 11 to 42 tooth 11-speed cassette in the rear, and is paired to a 42 tooth narrow ride chainring up front. Now this particular frame is a size 51, it's their small size, and the complete bike comes in at just over 24 pounds, with a pair of Shimano SPD pedals installed. Now the brakes are a big talking point here because the previous versions of this bike had purely mechanical disc brakes that were generally a problem for most cyclists who bought this bike. But State Bicycle actually did upgrade these brakes for the latest release to a new cable actuated hydraulic disc brake. More on that in just a little bit. Now the demo bike that I have here came with 650B wheels, and it came with the Vittoria Terreno dry tires, which are a really high quality 650B by 47mm tubeless ready tire. I was actually very surprised by that spec for this sort of entry level build, but it was a nice surprise nonetheless. Now the finishing kit, which consists of seat post, saddle, stem, handlebars, tape, that's all just State in-house components. They're very basic, nothing really special there. So that's a brief rundown on the specs of the bike. Now again, one of the biggest issues I think people were complaining about were the brakes. Most notably, a long form video by the guys over at the now defunct Cycling Tips really tore into the brakes on this bike, and even went as far as to call it irresponsible by State Bicycles to release a bike with those original brakes on here. Now the new brakes are a cable actuated hydraulic disc brake, which means they're still a cable disc brake, but the caliper itself has a hydraulic reservoir inside, which is supposed to give you a little bit better modulation and in some cases more power. Now in my case here, the brakes are passable for an entry-level gravel bike, and there's certainly more outright power than a cheap entry-level mechanical disc brake. Now fortunately, the brake levers do have a reach adjust, so I was able to get the levers into a relatively comfortable position to the point where I can actually lock up the rear brake from the hoods, which generally for me is sort of a benchmark for just raw power in a brake. Now the biggest thing for me is that there's really no modulation in these brakes. There's still a ton of spring tension in the system, which means you just need a lot of grip strength. And so once you do get to that point where you can feather the brakes, it's really hard to modulate them purely because it requires so much strength. Now again, this is a $1,400 entry-level gravel bike, so we definitely do need to manage our expectations here, but overall it's actually a pretty solid bike. Now for the amount of criticism that it's received in the past, there are also a ton of riders who swear by this bike. And so this particular bike is kind of an interesting case where the customer base is rather polarized. There's some people that love this bike, and then you've got the other side of the spectrum, the Dave Romes and the James Huangs out there who basically called this thing unrideable in its first iteration. Now one of the things that kind of gets me about this bike is they claim that it's a quote race ready all-road bike. Now what that means is totally up for debate, but for me race ready generally means a lightweight, high quality bike with quote race geometry, which this bike certainly does not have. The chainstays on this bike are relatively long at 435mm. Now in my experience, every kind of racy bike has a much shorter, more tucked chainstay length, which is definitely going to contribute to a quicker handling bike, again, which this bike is not. It's an interesting kind of ride. The bottom bracket is not very low, so I tend to feel like I'm kind of sitting on top of the bike. Now I do feel that there is a little bit of a mismatch between the front and the rear end of the bike. The relatively steep head tube angle makes the front end steering pretty quick, but then the back end feels really long. So it's almost like there's a little bit of a delay between the input at the bars and the actual back end of the bike coming around. Now if it's me designing this bike, I would either slacken out the front end just a little bit, or I would leave the front end of the bike as is and then just shorten the chainstays a little bit by 5, maybe 10mm, just so that the bike handles a little bit more intuitively. Now another thing I want to bring up that not a lot of the reviews have mentioned is the ride quality. Now I just went on a whole kick of a bunch of videos kind of claiming that aluminum is back and it's definitely not as harsh as it used to be. But then I rode a bike like this 6061 Allroad, and I was kind of immediately reminded of what a harsh bike feels like. Now even though the tires are awesome, in fact I'll even go as far as to say that these tires are like the nicest component on the bike, I still feel that this bike overall is really chattery. It's pretty harsh, and you can just really feel the stiffness in the bike overall. Whereas say on the Blackheart Allroad aluminum bike that I've been riding a lot lately, that bike's just got a nice muted feel to it, even with relatively high pressure 40C tires. So again, it's a case of not all frames are created equal, and depending on the, the budding profile and the welds and just the manufacturing process, you can get two totally different feels between bikes, even though the material is basically the same. Now, one thing that struck me is that this bike does ship with a 34.9mm diameter seat post, which is really wide. I'm not quite sure why they didn't ship with like a narrower seat post. I think maybe running a 27.2mm seat post could do a lot for the compliance and could actually reduce a lot of the harshness in this bike. So I was a little bit surprised to see that 34.9mm seat post. The other thing is that the frame only has two bottle mounting options, so on the seat tube and on the down tube. So you won't be able to mount anything to the top tube like directly or on the bottom side of the down tube. Now the standard fork that the bike ships with, it just has one mounting point on the side of the fork, but I do see that this updated version has a fender mount, which I don't believe the previous version had. Now one thing that I will mention about this group set that I do like is it is of course a threaded bottom bracket, and it uses external bearing cups like your typical Shimano Hollowtech 2 style crankset. Now in my experience, most entry-level sort of budget road and gravel bikes will often ship with a square taper bottom bracket, which tends to limit your options if you want to eventually upgrade in the future. So that is something that I was happy to see here. And then to elaborate just a little bit on the drivetrain itself, this Sensa group set does adopt the SRAM double tap style. So you click in halfway to shift down on the cassette, and you click in further to shift up on the cassette. It's a little bit tricky to get used to, but more importantly, it feels very imprecise. Like eventually you'll get into the gear that you want. And for me, shifting from an easier gear to a harder gear is always pretty straightforward and really easy. Is getting from a harder gear into an easier gear, that generally takes me a couple of times. You gotta kind of push on the lever a little bit further than you'd expect and wait for the chain to jump chain rings before you can release the lever. But once you get used to that, it does shift relatively consistently. I will say that the microshift Advent X system, hands down better shifting than this, but again, this is an 11 speed where the Advent X is only a 10 speed. The saddle is incredibly uncomfortable. I think this is a pretty common sentiment for people who buy this bike. I do get that for photos and marketing, a slim, sort of long, racy seat just looks good, but I haven't found anybody who is actually comfortable on this particular seat. And so that's something that kind of surprises me, because it's not as though a skinny race-looking saddle like this is any cheaper. There are definitely options for companies releasing budget-friendly bikes to spec a more comfortable saddle. Poseidon Bikes is one good example of that. They used to ship all their bikes with a very racy, narrow, uncomfortable saddle, and within the past year or so they actually listened to their customer feedback, and now they ship all their bikes with a way more comfortable saddle. It's a little bit wider, there's a little bit more padding, it's just more comfortable altogether. So I feel like there's no reason State shouldn't ship with a more comfortable saddle. Now speaking of Poseidon Bikes, that is another company that offers a really budget-friendly entry-level gravel bike. Now I feel like Poseidon's Ambition X is the closest thing in their lineup to the State 6061, and that's a bike that you can get for $900 new, but by the time you do the through axle upgrade and the hydraulic disc brake upgrade, you're at the same cost as this bike here. So it's kind of a wash in that sense. Now this is not a comparison video by any means, but for me the Ambition X was actually a more comfortable bike, despite the tires not being nearly as nice as these Vittorias. Now one of the last things that I'll mention is just the gear range of this 1x setup. Again, the cassette is 11 to 42 tooth in the back and is paired to a 42 tooth chain ring up front. Now personally for me, that's just geared way too high, especially if you live in any hilly areas. Now this bike for me continues to be a little bit of a paradox because it's claimed to be quote race ready, and so I kind of understand the tall gears in that respect, but it's also an entry-level bike through and through. And so if you're a cyclist who's just getting into gravel and this is going to be your first bike that you take off-road and you're getting into cycling shape and everything, a 1-to-1 gear ratio, which is what you get when you're in the lowest gear, that might sound low enough, but for me it's just definitely not a low enough low gear to get up any steep climbs with any efficiency. I would have liked to see, a more standard 40 tooth chainring up front, or even just be more realistic and go with a 38, but that's just my take on it. Okay, so I realized this was not a super organized video. I'm just out here on a ride, and so all these thoughts were kind of rattling around in my head. But to summarize, the State 6061 Black Label Allroad is a really solid bike for $1,400 US. The strongest points for me on this bike are the price point and the tires, to be honest. I mean, this is a really surprise spec for this bike. Now, as far as the things that I'm not particularly fond of, the saddle, it's just flat out uncomfortable. And then the other thing is just the gearing. It's a little bit too tall for me. Fortunately, it's actually pretty easy to swap the chain ring on this crankset if you wanted to. Now, the penultimate complaint that I have which is kind of a critical one, is just the geometry. It does feel a little bit off, so I would like to see either shorter chainstays on this bike or a more relaxed front end. And that brings me to the final gripe, which again, the brakes. Now, I'm not going to call it irresponsible or unrideable. I mean, I've been riding this bike for a while now, and it does fine. You just have to plan your lines accordingly and start braking a lot sooner than you would on, say, a nice hydraulic disc brake. You really need to be able to modulate the brakes with a much finer resolution than this brake setup can offer. So again, I know it may seem like I'm being pretty harsh on the brakes, but you should be aware that if you're in the market for a budget gravel bike like this, just the fact that it has cable actuated hydraulic disc brakes doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that same level of modulation as you would a full hydraulic disc brake. Okay, so I think that's everything I wanted to say. If I missed anything or if you have any additional questions, just drop them down below. I'll do my best to answer all your questions. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time.